In the autumn of 1912, survey crews working for the New York Central Railroad stood in a marsh at the northern edge of the Bronx and looked at a stream that ran directly through the middle of a planned rail yard. The stream was Tibbetts Brook, spring-fed, swelled by the overflow of Van Cortlandt Lake a half-mile upstream, and for nearly 2 centuries it had run south from that lake through open meadow and salt marsh toward the Harlem River. The Van Cortlandt family had dammed it in the 1700s to turn a grist mill. Farmers downstream had drawn on it for generations, and in winter the frozen lake above it had supplied ice to half the northern Bronx, cut in blocks and hauled out by horse teams before the age of mechanical refrigeration. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The marsh the surveyors stood in that autumn was still tidal in places, reed-choked, cut by muskrat trails, the kind of ground nobody had ever thought worth building on. But the railroad needed level ground for switching track, storage sidings, and a connection into the West Side freight line, and a stream running diagonally across that ground was not an asset. It was an obstruction, noted on the survey plat with a single dashed line and a marginal note indicating the finished grade would cross it below the surface. The engineers did not bridge it, they boxed it. Working through 1912 and into the following year, crews laid a masonry and later concrete conduit along the brook's lower course, dropped the water into it below grade, and built the yard directly on top. The stream that had reached the Harlem River on its own for longer than the city had existed stopped reaching it. Its water was redirected into the combined sewer system, the same network of pipes that carries storm runoff and raw sewage together during heavy rain, and it has flowed that way for more than a century. This is an account of what happened to Tibbetts Brook and to a small number of other American streams that met railroad engineers with the same problem and received the same answer, and of the paper trail those decisions left behind in yard plans, insurance atlases, and sewer maps that quietly stopped naming the water once it went underground. To understand why a railroad company would choose to erase a stream rather than cross it, you have to understand what building a trunk line looked like in the second half of the 19th century. Between the 1850s and the turn of the century, American railroads laid more than 190,000 miles of track, much of it through terrain that had never been surveyed for anything heavier than a farm wagon. Every mile needed a level, continuous grade, and the ground it crossed was rarely level. It was cut by thousands of small watercourses, creeks a few feet deep and a few feet wide, unremarkable on their own, but numerous enough that bridging every one of them at true grade would have added months and enormous cost to construction that companies were racing to finish before their competitors and before their financing ran out. The solution that emerged, and that hardened into standard practice by the time the American Railway Engineering Association began publishing formal specifications at the close of the 1890s, was the culvert. Where a stream was small enough, the railroad did not build a bridge with piers and a span. It built a box, stone or brick, and later concrete, laid the stream into the box below the grade line, and buried the box under fill. The water still moved. It simply stopped being visible from the surface. For a creek running through open farmland, this changed little beyond its appearance on a map. For a creek running through a city that was still growing when the culvert went in, where the land above it would soon carry streets, factories, rail yards, and generations of families who had never seen the water at all, the decision became something closer to permanent erasure. Tibbetts Brook was one case among hundreds, but its record is unusually complete, because the borough it ran through kept building on top of it for another century, and each layer left paper behind. The men who actually built these culverts left almost nothing behind in their own words, but the physical structures they built describe the work well enough. A box culvert of the period was laid in an open trench dug ahead of the advancing grade. The stream diverted temporarily around the work site, while masons set the invert, the curved or flat floor the water would run over, then built up the side walls in coursed stone or brick, and closed the top with an arch or a flat reinforced cap before the fill went in above it. Crews worked in standing water for weeks at a time, in ground that would not drain, using pumps that failed as often as they ran, and the culverts that survive intact today, a century or more later, are a rough monument to how carefully that work was actually done, even when nobody involved expected the structure to still be carrying water 100 years on. Railroad companies did not publicize this labor. It appears in construction ledgers, in claims filed after workers were injured or killed in trench collapses, and in the terse language of completion reports that note a stream diverted, boxed, and closed on a given date with no further comment, because to the company that had built it, the stream was now finished business. The ground beneath the Bronx did not care that a rail yard had been platted across a stream valley. Water still followed gravity, and gravity still pulled it toward the Harlem River, along the same low ground it had used for millennia. The culvert built in 1912 was sized for a modest, spring-fed brook running at its ordinary volume, not for the runoff of an entire drainage basin during a storm. Van Cortlandt Park sits at the head of a watershed that drains close to 3 square miles of the northwest Bronx and southern Yonkers, nearly all of it now covered in roofs, roads, and parking lots that shed rain far faster than the meadow ever did. Every time that basin takes a hard rain, the volume reaching the old brook channel exceeds what the century-old pipe beneath the rail yard can carry, and the excess has nowhere sanctioned to go. It surfaces in the park as flooding around the lake and the golf course. It overwhelms the combined sewer it was forced into, and the sewer, built to handle exactly this kind of overload by design, opens its relief points and discharges a mixture of stormwater and untreated sewage directly into the Harlem River. The New York City Department of Environmental Protection has documented this pattern for years in its long-term control plans for the Harlem River watershed, and Tibbetts Brook is named specifically in those plans, not as a curiosity, but as a quantified contributor of clean water being treated as sewage because a rail yard was laid over its outlet more than a century ago. The department's own figures put the volume that daylighting could remove from the combined system at several 100 million gallons a year. The stream did not disappear when the railroad buried it. It became, on paper, a liability the city is still paying to manage. Tibbetts Brook was not an isolated decision, and the same pattern appears, with a different institutional cast, 400 miles to the north. Stony Brook once ran openly through Jamaica Plain and Roxbury on the southern edge of Boston, feeding into the muddy river system before reaching the harbor. As the Boston and Providence Railroad, and later the corridor that would carry the Penn Central and eventually the MBTA's Orange Line, pushed south through the same low ground the stream occupied, engineers across several decades of construction, beginning in the 1880s and continuing well into the 20th century, culverted Stony Brook in stages, folding it into a masonry and later concrete conduit that ran beneath the widening transportation corridor. By the middle of the 20th century, the stream existed almost entirely underground, its old surface course replaced by rail yards, roadways, and eventually the elevated and then relocated transit line that gave the corridor its modern shape. The culvert held for decades, largely forgotten, until August of 1996, when a combination of heavy rain and debris blocking the conduit caused Stony Brook to back up under pressure it had not carried in a century. Water forced its way up through manholes and building foundations in the Back Bay and South End, flooding basements, shutting down sections of the Orange Line, and causing tens of millions of dollars in damage across neighborhoods where most residents had no idea a stream ran beneath their streets at all. The Massachusetts Water Resources Authority and the city's Public Works Department spent the following years reinforcing and enlarging the culvert, treating the failure as an engineering problem to be solved rather than a reason to reconsider whether the stream belonged underground at all. The brook was patched, not released. 12 miles north of Tibbetts Brook, in downtown Yonkers, the Sawmill River met a nearly identical fate, though the institution that buried it was less a single railroad than an entire century of downtown development built around one. The sawmill ran through the heart of Yonkers on its way to the Hudson, and as the city industrialized around its mills and its New York Central Hudson Line station, the river became an increasingly inconvenient feature sitting in the middle of what planners wanted as a commercial center. Piece by piece across the early 20th century, sections were culverted and decked over. By the 1920s, much of the downtown course ran invisible beneath streets, and by mid-century the final stretch through Getty Square had been buried under a parking lot and a low retail structure, the river reduced to a storm drain running under asphalt where cars parked for the shops above it. For nearly 90 years, residents of Yonkers walked, drove, and parked directly over a river most of them did not know was there. The physical evidence of the burial survived in the culvert itself, a series of masonry and concrete channels of different ages stacked on top of one another as different decades added their own repairs, plainly documented once engineers finally went back in to look. When the city, working with the non-profit Groundwork Hudson Valley, began planning to bring the river back to the surface in the 2000s, engineers surveying the culvert found it in far better structural condition than the pavement above it. Brick arches from the 1910s still sound, later concrete sections showing the ordinary wear of a century underground, but nothing close to failure. The river had simply been waiting the entire time, carrying its water through the dark exactly as it had been built to, unseen and unacknowledged, while 3 generations of Yonkers residents did their shopping on the concrete lid above it. The pattern holds in Queens as well, on ground built not by a city, but by a single railroad acting at a scale few private companies have ever matched. In Long Island City, Sunswick Creek once drained a broad stretch of what is now some of the densest rail infrastructure in the country. When the Pennsylvania Railroad built Sunnyside Yard in the first decade of the 20th century, one of the largest rail yards ever constructed on the eastern seaboard, the marsh and stream network the yard was built across, Sunswick Creek included, was filled, culverted, and folded into the borough's growing storm sewer system. The creek's name persists mostly in the memory of local hydrologists and in the flooding patterns that still trace its old course. Long Island City floods along a line that does not match the current street grid but matches, almost exactly, the historic path of a stream that has not run in open air for more than 100 years. City stormwater engineers, when asked to explain why certain blocks flood before others during heavy rain, despite modern drainage upgrades, point to the old watershed maps rather than the current ones, because the old maps show where the water still wants to go. The infrastructure changed, the topography underneath it did not. What connects these cases is not coincidence, and it is not a single decision made once and repeated by imitation. It is a structural incentive that ran through the entire era of American rail expansion and the municipal development that followed it onto the same ground. Railroads building for speed and shareholders had no reason to preserve a stream's visibility, only its manageable flow. Cities and transit authorities absorbing that infrastructure decades later, needing buildable land in already crowded boroughs, had every reason to keep the water hidden and little incentive to restore it, since restoring it meant admitting that valuable land sat on unstable, water-bearing ground. The institutions involved changed over the decades, from the New York Central, the Pennsylvania Railroad, and the Boston and Providence Railroad to the municipal water and transit authorities that inherited their infrastructure, but the underlying decision was never seriously revisited, because revisiting it meant confronting the cost of a mistake nobody currently in office had made. The stream became someone else's problem the moment the culvert was finished, and it has been someone else's problem, quietly, ever since. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. What makes this pattern legible today is the paper it left behind, and the paper survives in 3 places, each keeping a different kind of record. The first is the historic topographic map, the sheets produced by the United States Geological Survey beginning in the 1890s, which show Tibbetts Brook, Stony Brook, the Sawmill River, and Sunswick Creek in their full open courses before the railroads and the cities finished burying them. Laid beside a modern map of the same ground, the comparison is direct. Blue lines that once ran for miles simply stop, absorbed into a street grid that shows no trace of them. The second record is the Sanborn Fire Insurance Atlas, produced block by block for American cities from the 1860s through the mid-20th century to help insurers assess risk, which in many cases captured the exact years a given stretch of stream was decked over, because a newly buildable lot, appearing where open water had been, the previous edition, was exactly the kind of change a fire insurance surveyor was trained to note. The third record, the most technical and the least visited, is the Sewer Atlas itself, the working document every city's water and sewer department maintains showing what runs beneath its streets. In New York City's atlases, Tibbetts Brook does not appear as a stream. It appears as an interceptor sewer, sized, dated, and connected to the treatment system like any other engineered line, its origin as a spring-fed brook, noted, if at all, only in the annotation of engineers who happened to know the history and thought it worth writing down. Reading these three kinds of record against each other is slow, deliberate work, closer to archival reconstruction than field work, and for most of the 20th century, almost nobody had a professional reason to do it. A sewer engineer needed to know pipe diameter and slope, not the name of the stream the pipe had replaced. A city planner needed to know what could legally be built on a parcel, not what had run across it in 1890. It took the rise of urban hydrology as its own discipline, in the final decades of the 20th century, for anyone to sit down with a Sanborn Atlas from 1910, a topographic sheet from 1891, and a modern sewer plan side by side, and ask what had actually happened to the water in between. The reason this reconstruction has taken until the last 2 decades to happen at any scale is straightforward, and it has little to do with the difficulty of reading old maps. It has to do with who benefits from the water staying invisible. A buried stream, once forgotten, becomes buildable land, taxable, developable, free of the wetland and floodplain restrictions that would apply if the water were still on the surface. Every institution that has owned the ground above one of these streams, from the original railroad to the municipal agencies that inherited the infrastructure to the private developers who later built on top of the easements, has had a direct financial interest in the water remaining exactly where the early engineers put it. The New York City Department of Environmental Protection did not begin seriously studying the daylighting of Tibbetts Brook because someone rediscovered an old map by accident. It began because federal consent decrees around combined sewer overflow requiring cities to reduce the volume of untreated discharge into their waterways made the cost of continuing to hide the brook in fines and in mandated infrastructure upgrades higher than the cost of finally dealing with it. The economics changed before the engineering did, and it is worth being precise about what that means. Nobody at the New York City Department of Environmental Protection woke up one morning newly concerned about a forgotten Bronx brook out of civic sentiment. A regulatory framework built to protect the Harlem River from raw sewage discharge assigned a dollar figure to every gallon of clean stormwater still routed through the combined system, and once that figure existed, the century-old decision to bury Tibbetts Brook stopped being invisible and started being a line item. The same recalculation is what eventually moved the Sawmill River project in Yonkers from a preservationist's proposal to a funded municipal priority, and it is the same recalculation Boston has so far declined to make about Stony Brook, choosing instead to keep paying, storm by storm, for a patch rather than a cure. The stream itself never changed at all. It kept doing exactly what it had done for 10,000 years, moving downhill toward the river, indifferent to what had been built on top of it. The clearest recent demonstration of that indifference came in September of 2021, when the remnants of Hurricane Ida dropped record rainfall across New York City in a matter of hours. The Bronx took some of the worst of it. Streets around Kingsbridge and Van Cortlandt Park flooded to depths that trapped cars and forced water into basement apartments, and the storm drains along the old brook's buried course, the same pipe network built in 1912 to make the stream disappear, simply could not move water fast enough to keep up with a storm that intense. City engineers reviewing the damage afterward pointed directly at the Tibbetts Brook corridor as one of the areas where legacy infrastructure, built for a much smaller and slower-moving watershed than the one that now drains into it, was structurally unable to cope. The storm did not create a new problem. It exposed, in a single violent night, the exact problem the daylighting plan had already been designed to fix, and it did so in a way that a century of quiet annual flooding around the park's lake had never quite managed to make urgent to anyone outside the neighborhood. The current plan for Tibbetts Brook, developed by the city over the past several years, calls for rerouting the buried stream around the old Kingsbridge rail yard, now largely disused, and returning it to open air in a new channel that would carry it the final stretch to the Harlem River, removing it from the combined sewer system entirely. Engineers working on the design have had to account for a full century of infrastructure never built with the stream's eventual return in mind. Foundations, utility lines, and roadbeds laid directly over ground that the original 19th century surveys marked as active floodplain. The project sits, as of this telling, in roughly the same position the Sawmill River project sat in for years before construction finally began in Yonkers, fully designed, publicly committed to, and waiting on funding and sequencing that moves at the pace of a municipal capital budget rather than the pace of the water itself. What the Sawmill River project proved, when the concrete lid finally came off downtown Yonkers in 2010 and 2011, was that the water had never needed rescuing in any dramatic sense. It had been running the entire time, clean enough and constant enough that engineers were able to route it into a new open channel within months of the physical barrier above it coming down. The river did not need to be revived, it needed only to be uncovered. Longtime Yonkers residents who watched the excavation in 2010 described the same reaction in interviews given to local papers at the time, a kind of quiet disbelief that the water had been there the whole time, running beneath the exact spot where they had parked for decades to buy groceries or catch a train. Several recalled parents or grandparents who had mentioned, almost in passing, that there used to be a river downtown, a detail that had settled into local memory as something closer to legend than fact, until the pavement came up and the legend turned out to be a documented engineering decision from 1900 and something, recoverable in the city's own permit records once anyone thought to look. The park built along the reopened channel, named for the 17th century Dutch settler Adrian van der Donck, now draws residents to sit beside water that their own city government had spent most of a century actively hiding from them, not through any single act of concealment, but through the accumulated, unremarkable decisions of one department after another, choosing not to disturb what the previous department had already paved over. Stony Brook offers the opposite lesson from the same underlying condition. Boston did not daylight its buried stream after the flood of 1996. It reinforced the culvert and left the water exactly where the railroad had put it, more than a century earlier, choosing containment over disclosure, once the cost of admitting the problem outright became visible on the evening news. There is a version of this story that could be told as a handful of isolated engineering decisions, each corrected in turn a century later, and that version would not be false, but it would miss the scale of what the topographic and Sanborn record actually shows once you go looking beyond the 4 watercourses named here. Baltimore's Jones Falls runs partly open and partly culverted beneath the light rail line and the interstate that parallel it downtown, a condition traced directly to 19th century rail and industrial development along the same valley. Washington had a stream called Tibbetts Creek that once ran openly near the base of Capitol Hill before it was culverted in the 1870s to become part of the city's sewer system, its former course now buried under the National Mall and the rail approaches feeding Union Station. Cities as far from the East Coast as Cincinnati and Providence have documented stream burials tied directly to 19th century rail construction, catalogued in recent decades by municipal stormwater departments forced, largely by federal clean water requirements, to finally map what their own infrastructure was sitting on. In nearly every case, the pattern repeats with only minor variation. A railroad or a growing city faced a small watercourse sitting in the way of a grade, a yard, or a block of buildable frontage, and rather than design around the water, it designed the water out of view, confident that a stream nobody could see was a stream nobody would ask about. None of these are secret in the sense of being actively concealed today. The sewer atlases are public records. The historic topographic sheets sit in university map libraries, largely digitized and searchable. But none of them were ever assembled into a single accounting of how much of the country's original stream network survives, buried and functioning, under the rail lines and rail yards that first swallowed it, until environmental engineers had a legal and financial reason to look. The water was never lost. It was simply never anyone's job to say where it had gone. What the current record shows, watershed by watershed, is a stream network under the northeastern United States that is far more intact than its absence from any modern map would suggest. Tibbetts Brook still runs at something close to its original volume, carried now through pipe instead of open channel, still fed by the same springs, still governed by the same rainfall patterns that governed it before Van Cortlandt ever dammed it for a mill. Stony Brook still moves beneath the orange line at the volume the 1880s engineers never planned for, patched and reinforced but never released, waiting on the next storm large enough to test the patch. The Sawmill River, for the stretch that remains buried north and south of the daylighted section in Yonkers, still moves exactly as it did under the parking lot that used to sit above it, waiting on the next phase of a project that has already proven the water was never the obstacle. Sunswick Creek still finds its own path beneath Sunnyside Yard during every hard rain in Long Island City, tracing a watershed boundary that predates the borough, the railroad, and the city that grew up around both. None of it required rediscovery in the sense of finding something new. It required only the willingness to read the old maps against the new ones and admit that the water underneath a rail yard is not gone simply because no one built a bridge to look at it. Every one of these streams is, in the plainest engineering sense, still doing its job. Tibbetts Brook still carries the runoff of 3 square miles down to the river it was cut off from. Stony Brook still carries the drainage of Jamaica Plain under a transit line that has never once had to reroute around it. The culverts have not failed in any structural sense that would force a reckoning on their own. They have simply kept working, quietly, exactly as designed, for so long that the decision behind them stopped looking like a decision at all and started looking like the natural order of the ground itself, the way a street looks permanent to anyone who never saw the map from before the street was there. The rail yards above them are still active or newly repurposed, the parking lots are still full, the transit lines are still running on schedule, and underneath every one of them, in the dark, on the same grade the railroad engineers cut for it more than a century ago, the water is still moving toward the river it was always trying to reach. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.